Ghosts, a family drama in 3 acts, 1881. Characters: Mrs. Helen Alving, widow of Captain Alving, late chamberlain to the king. Note: Chamberlain, Kammerherre, is the only title of honor now existing in Norway. It is a distinction conferred by the king on men of wealth and position, and is not hereditary. Oswald Alving, her son, a painter. Pastor Manders, Jacob Engstrand, a carpenter. Regina Engstrand, Mrs. Alving's maid. The action takes place at Mrs. Alving's country house, beside one of the large fjords in western Norway.
Act 1. A spacious garden room with one door to the left and 2 doors to the right. In the middle of the room, a round table with chairs around it. On the table lie books, periodicals, and newspapers. In the foreground, to the left a window, and by it a small sofa, with a work table in front of it. In the background, the room is continued into a somewhat narrower conservatory, which is shut in by glass walls with large panes. In the right-hand wall of the conservatory is a door leading down into the garden. Through the glass wall, one catches a glimpse of a gloomy fjord landscape veiled by steady rain. Engstrand, the carpenter, stands by the garden door. His left leg is rather crooked. He has a clump of wood under the sole of his boot. Regina, with an empty garden syringe in her hand, hinders him from advancing. The Norwegian title gengangere is not exactly represented by our word ghosts. It means literally again-goers, spirits that walk. The French word revenants comes nearer the sense. Regina, in a low voice, "What do you want?" "Stop where you are positively dripping." Engstrand. "It's the Lord's own rain, my girl." Regina. "It's the devil's rain, I say." Engstrand. "Lord, how you talk, Regina." Limps a few steps forward into the room. "What I wanted to say was this, Regina. Don't clatter so with that foot of yours, I tell you. The young master is asleep upstairs." Engstrand. "Asleep? In the middle of the day?" Regina. "It's no business of yours, Engstrand. I was out on the loose last night. Regina, I can quite believe that." Engstrand. "Yes, we're weak vessels, we poor mortals, my girl." Regina, "So it seems." Engstrand. "And temptations are manifold in this world, you see. But all the same, I was hard at work, God knows, at 5:30 this morning." Regina. "Very well. Only be off now. I won't stop here and have rendezvous with you." Engstrand. "What is it you won't have, Regina?" "I won't have anyone find you here. So just you go about your business." Engstrand advances a step or two. "Blessed if I go before I've had a talk with you. This afternoon I shall have finished my work down at the schoolhouse, and then I shall take tonight's boat and be off home to the town." Regina mutters, "A pleasant journey to you." Engstrand. "Thank you, my child. Tomorrow the asylum is to be opened, and then there'll be fine doings, no doubt, and plenty of intoxicating drink going, you know, and nobody shall say of Jacob Engstrand that he can't keep out of temptation's way." Regina. "Oh, Engstrand, you see, there are to be any number of swells here tomorrow. Pastor Manders is expected from town, too." Regina. "He's coming today." Engstrand. "There, you see, and I should be cursedly sorry if he found out anything to my disadvantage, don't you understand?" Regina. "Oh, is that your game?" Engstrand. "Is what my game, Regina," looking hard at him. "Going to play on Pastor Manders. What trick are you, Engstrand?" "Hush, hush. Are you crazy? Do I want to play any trick on Pastor Manders? Oh, no. Pastor Manders has been far too kind to me for that. But I just wanted to tell you, you know, that I mean to set off home again tonight." Regina. "The sooner the better for my part." Engstrand. "Yes, but I want to take you with me, Regina." Regina, open-mouthed. "You want me you talking about?" "What are Engstrand? I want to take you home, I say." Regina, scornfully. "Never in this world shall you get me home with you." Engstrand. "We shall see about that." Regina. "Yes, you may be sure we shall see about it. I, who have been brought up by a lady like Mrs. Alvingham, who am treated almost as a daughter here. Is it me you want to go home with you? To a house like yours? For shame." Engstrand. "What the devil do you mean yourself up against your father, girl? Do you set Regina? mutters without looking at him. You've said often enough that I was no child of yours. Engstrand. Stuff. Why should you trouble about that? Regina, haven't you many a time sworn at me and called me a fidunk Engstrand? Curse me now if I ever use such an ugly word. Regina. Oh, I know quite well what word you used. Engstrand. Well, but that was only when I was a bit on, don't you know? Temptations are manifold in this world, Regina. Regina, ugh.
Engstrand. And besides, it was when your mother was that aggravating. I had to find something to twit her with, my child. She was always setting up for a fine lady. Mimics. Let me go, Engstrand. Let me be. Remember, I was 3 years in Chamberlain Alving's family at Rosenwald. Laughs. Mercy on us. She could never forget that the captain was made a chamberlain while she was in service here. Regina. Poor mother. You very soon tormented her into her grave. Engstrand, with a twist of his shoulders. Oh, of course. I'm to have the blame for everything. Regina turns away, half aloud. Ugh! And that leg too. Engstrand. What do you say, my child? Regina. Pied de mouton. Engstrand. Is that English, eh? Regina. Yes. Engstrand. I. You've picked up some learning out here, and that may come in useful now, Regina. Regina. After a short silence. What do you want with me in town? Engstrand. Can you ask what a father wants with his only child? Ain't I a lonely, forlorn widower? Regina. Oh, don't try on any nonsense like that with me. Why do you want me? Engstrand. Well, let me tell you, I've... Regina, contemptuously. You've tried that often enough, and much good you've done with it. Engstrand. Yes, but this time you shall see, Regina. Devil take me. Regina. Stamps. Stop your swearing, Engstrand. Hush, hush. You're right enough there, my girl. What I wanted to say was just this. I've laid by a very tidy pile from this orphanage job. Regina. Have you? That's a good thing for you. Engstrand. What can a man spend his ha'pence on here in this country hole? Regina. Well, what then? Engstrand. Why, you see, I thought of putting the money into some paying speculation. I thought of a sort of a sailor's tavern. Regina. Pa, Engstrand. A regular high-class affair, of course. Not any sort of pigsty for common sailors. No, damn it. It would be for captains and mates and regular swells, you know. Regina. And I was to... Engstrand. You were to help, to be sure. Only for the look of the thing, you understand. Devil a bit of hard work shall you have, my girl. You shall do exactly what you like. Regina. Oh, indeed. Engstrand. But there must be a petticoat in the house. That's as clear as daylight. For I want to have it a bit lively like in the evenings, with singing and dancing and so on. You must remember they're weary wanderers on the ocean of life. Nearer. Now don't be a fool and stand in your own light, Regina. What's to become of you out here? Your mistress has given you a lot of learning, but what good is that to you? You're to look after the children at the new orphanage, I hear. Is that the sort of thing for you, eh? Are you so dead set on wearing your life out for a pack of dirty brats? Regina. No. If things go as I want them to, well, there's no saying. There's no saying. Engstrand. What do you mean by, there's no saying? Regina. Never you mind. How much money have you saved? Engstrand. What with one thing and another, a matter of 700 or 800 crowns. A krone is equal to 1 shilling and 3 halfpence. Regina. That's not so bad. Engstrand. It's enough to make a start with, my girl. Regina. Aren't you thinking of giving me any? Engstrand. No, I'm blessed if I am. Regina. Not even of sending me a scrap of stuff for a new dress? Engstrand. Come to town with me, my lass, and you'll soon get dresses enough. Regina. Pooh, I can do that on my own account, if I want to. Engstrand. No, a father's guiding hand is what you want, Regina. Now, I've got my eye on a capital house in Little Harbor Street. They don't want much ready money, and it could be a sort of a sailor's home, you know. Regina. But I will not live with you. I have nothing whatever to do with you. Be off. Engstrand. You wouldn't stop long with me, my girl. no such luck. If you knew how to play your cards, such a fine figure of a girl as you've grown in the last year or two. Regina. Well? Engstrand. You'd soon get hold of some mate, or maybe even a captain. Regina. I won't marry anyone of that sort. Sailors have no savoir-vivre. Engstrand. What's that they haven't got? Regina. I know what sailors are, I tell you. They're not the sort of people to marry. Engstrand. Then never mind about marrying them. You can make it pay all the same. More confidentially. He, the Englishman, the man with the yacht, he came down with $300, he did, and she wasn't a bit handsomer than you. Regina. Making for him. Out you go! Engstrand. Falling back. Come, come. You're not going to hit me, I hope. Regina. Yes, if you begin talking about mother, I shall hit you. Get away with you, I say. Drives him back towards the garden door. And don't slam the doors. Young Mr. Alving. Engstrand. He's asleep, I know. You're mightily taken up about young Mr. Alving. More softly. Oh ho, you don't mean to say it's him as... Regina. Be off this minute. You're crazy, I tell you. No, not that way. There comes... Pastor Manders, down the kitchen stairs with you. Engstrand, towards the right. Yes, yes, I'm going. But just you talk to him as is coming there. He's the man to tell you what a child owes its father. For I am your father all the same, you know. I can prove it from the church register. He goes out through the second door to the right, which Regina has opened and closes again after him. Regina glances hastily at herself in the mirror, dusts herself with her pocket handkerchief, and settles her necktie. Then she busies herself with the flowers. Pastor Manders, wearing an overcoat, carrying an umbrella, and with a small traveling bag on a strap over his shoulder, comes through the garden door into the conservatory. Manders. Good morning, Miss Engstrand. Regina, turning round, surprised and pleased. No, really. Good morning, Pastor Manders. Is the steamer in already? Manders. It is just in. Enters the sitting room. Terrible weather we have been having lately. Regina. Follows him. It's such blessed weather for the country, sir. Manders. No doubt. You are quite right. We townspeople give too little thought to that. He begins to take of his overcoat. Regina. Oh, mayn't I help you? There. Why, how wet it is. I'll just hang it up in the hall. And your umbrella, too. I'll open it and let it dry. She goes out with the things through the second door on the right. Pastor Manders takes off his traveling bag and lays it and his hat on a chair. Meanwhile, Regina comes in again. Manders. Ah, it's a comfort to get safe under cover. I hope everything is going on well here. Regina. Yes, thank you, sir. Manders. You have your hands full, I suppose, in preparation for tomorrow? Regina. Yes, there's plenty to do, of course. Manders. And Mrs. Alving is at home, I trust? Regina. Oh dear, yes. She's just upstairs looking after the young master's chocolate. Manders. Yes, by the by. I heard down at the pier that Oswald had arrived. Regina. Yes, he came the day before yesterday. We didn't expect him before today. Manders. Quite strong and well, I hope. Regina. Yes, thank you, quite, but dreadfully tired with the journey. He has made one rush right through from Paris, the whole way in one train, I believe. He's sleeping a little now, I think, so perhaps we'd better talk a little quietly. Manders. Shh. As quietly as you please. Regina, arranging an armchair beside the table. Now do sit down, Pastor Manders, and make yourself comfortable. He sits down. She places a footstool under his feet. There. Are you comfortable now, sir? Manders, thanks, extremely so. Looks at her. Do you know, Miss Engstrand, I positively believe you have grown since I last saw you. Regina. Do you think so, sir? Mrs. Alving says I've filled out too. Manders. Filled out? Well, perhaps a little. Just enough. Short pause. Regina. Shall I tell Mrs. Alving you are here? Manders. Thanks, there is no hurry, my dear child. By the by, Regina, my good girl, tell me, how is your father getting on out here? Regina. Oh, thank you, sir. He's getting on well enough. Manders. He called upon me last time he was in town. Regina. Did he indeed? He's always so glad of a chance of talking to you, sir. Manders. And you often look in upon him at his work, I dare say? Regina. Oh, of course, when I have time, Manders. Your father is not a man of strong character, Miss Engstrand. He stands terribly in need of a guiding hand. Regina. Oh, yes, I dare say he does. Manders. He requires someone near him whom he cares for, and whose judgment he respects. He frankly admitted as much when he last came to see me. Regina. Yes, he mentioned something of the sort to me. But I don't know whether Mrs. Alving can spare me, especially now that we've got the new orphanage to attend to. And then I should be so sorry to leave Mrs. Alving. She has always been so kind to me. Manders. But a daughter's duty, my good girl. Of course we should first have to get your mistress's consent. Regina. But I don't know whether it would be quite proper for me, at my age, to keep house for a single man. Manders. What? My dear Miss Engstrand, when the man is your own father. Regina. Yes, that may be. But all the same, now if it were in a thoroughly nice house, and with a real gentleman, Manders. Why, my dear Regina, one I could love and respect and be a daughter to, Manders. Yes, but my dear, good child, Regina. Then I should be glad to go to town. It's very lonely out here. You know yourself, sir, what it is to be alone in the world, and I can assure you I'm both quick and willing. Don't you know of any such place for me, sir? Manders. I? No, certainly not. Regina. But dear, dear sir, do remember me if... Manders. Rising. Yes, certainly, Miss Engstrand, Regina. For if I... Manders. Will you be so good as to tell your mistress I am here? Regina. I will at once, sir. She goes out to the left. Manders. Paces the room 2 or 3 times, stands a moment in the background with his hands behind his back, and looks out over the garden. Then he returns to the table, takes up a book, and looks at the title page, starts, and looks at several books. Ha, indeed. Mrs. Alving enters by the door on the left. She is followed by Regina, who immediately goes out by the first door on the right. Mrs. Alving holds out her hand. Welcome, my dear pastor, Manders. How do you do, Mrs. Alving? Here I am, as I promised. Mrs. Alving, always punctual to the minute. Manders. You may believe it was not so easy for me to get away, with all the boards and committees I belong to. Mrs. Alving. That makes it all the kinder of you to come so early. Now we can get through our business before dinner. But where is your portmanteau? Manders. Quickly. I left it down at the inn. I shall sleep there tonight. Mrs. Alving, suppressing a smile. Are you really not to be persuaded even now to pass the night under my roof? Manders. No, Mrs. Alving. Many thanks. I shall stay at the inn, as usual. It is so conveniently near the landing stage. Mrs. Alving. Well, you must have your own way. But I really should have thought we 2 old people, Manders. Now you are making fun of me. Ah, you're naturally in great spirits today. What with tomorrow's festival and Oswald's return. Mrs. Alving. Yes, you can think what a delight it is to me. It's more than 2 years since he was home last, and now he has promised to stay with me all the winter. Manders. Has he really? That is very nice and dutiful of him. For I can well believe that life in Rome and Paris has very different attractions from any we can offer here. Mrs. Alving. Ah, but here he has his mother, you see. My own darling boy, he hasn't forgotten his old mother, Manders. It would be grievous indeed if absence and absorption in art and that sort of thing were to blunt his natural feelings. Mrs. Alving. Yes, you may well say so. But there's nothing of that sort to fear with him. I'm quite curious to see whether you know him again. He'll be down presently. He's upstairs just now, resting a little on the sofa. But do sit down, my dear pastor. Manders. Thank you. Are you quite at liberty? Mrs. Alving. Certainly. She sits by the table. Manders. Very well. Then let me show you. He goes to the chair where his traveling bag lies, takes out a packet of papers, sits down on the opposite side of the table, and tries to find a clear space for the papers. Now, to begin with, here is... breaking off. Tell me, Mrs. Alving, How do these books come to be here? Mrs. Alving, these books? They are books I am reading. Books I am... Manders, do you read this sort of literature? Mrs. Alving, certainly I do. Manders, do you feel better or happier for such reading? Mrs. Alving, I feel, so to speak, more secure. Manders, that is strange. How do you mean? Mrs. Alving, well, I seem to find explanation and confirmation of all sorts of things I myself have been thinking. For that is the wonderful part of it, Pastor Manders. There is really nothing new in these books, nothing but what most people think and believe. Only most people either don't formulate it to themselves or else keep quiet about it. Manders, great heavens. Do you really believe that most people? Mrs. Alving, I do indeed. Manders, but surely not in this country? Not here among us? Mrs. Alving, yes, certainly. Here as elsewhere. Manders, well, I really must say. Mrs. Alving, for the rest, what do you object to in these books? Manders, object to in them? You surely do not suppose that I have nothing better to do than to study such publications as these? Mrs. Alving, that is to say, you know nothing of what you are condemning? Manders, I have read enough about these writings to disapprove of them. Mrs. Alving, yes, but your own judgment. Manders, my dear Mrs. Alving, there are many occasions in life when one must rely upon others. Things are so ordered in this world, and it is well that they are. Otherwise, what would become of society? Mrs. Alving, well, well, I dare say you're right there. Manders, besides, I of course do not deny that there may be much that is attractive in such books. Nor can I blame you for wishing to keep up with the intellectual movements that are said to be going on in the great world, where you have let your son pass so much of his life. But, Mrs. Alving, but? Manders, lowering his voice, but one should not talk about it, Mrs. Alving. One is certainly not bound to account to everybody for what one reads and thinks within one's own four walls. Mrs. Alving, of course not. I quite agree with you. Manders, only think now how you are bound to consider the interests of this orphanage, which you decided on founding at a time when, if I understand you rightly, you thought very differently on spiritual matters. Mrs. Alving, oh yes, I quite admit that. But it was about the orphanage. Manders, it was about the orphanage we were to speak. Yes. All I say is prudence, my dear lady. And now let us get to business. Opens the packet and takes out a number of papers. Do you see these? Mrs. Alving, the documents, Manders, all and in perfect order. I can tell you it was hard work to get them in time. I had to put on strong pressure. The authorities are almost morbidly scrupulous when there is any decisive step to be taken. But here they are at last. Looks through the bundle. See? Here is the formal deed of gift of the parcel. Of ground known as Solvik in the manor of Rosenwald, with all the newly constructed buildings, schoolrooms, master's house, and chapel. And here is the legal fiat for the endowment and for the bylaws of the institution. Will you look at them? Reads, bylaws for the children's home to be known as Captain Alving's Foundation. Mrs. Alving looks long at the paper. So there it is, Manders. I have chosen the designation captain rather than chamberlain. Captain looks less pretentious. Mrs. Alving, oh yes, just as you think best. Manders, and here you have the bank account of the capital lying at interest to cover the current expenses of the orphanage. Mrs. Alving, thank you, but please keep it. It will be more convenient. Manders, with pleasure. I think we will leave the money in the bank for the present. The interest is certainly not what we could wish, 4% and 6 months' notice of withdrawal. If a good mortgage could be found later on, of course it must be a first mortgage, and an unimpeachable security, then we could consider the matter. Mrs. Alving, certainly, my dear Pastor Manders, you are the best judge in these things. Manders, I will keep my eyes open at any rate. But now there is one thing more which I have several times been intending to ask you. Mrs. Alving, and what is that? Manders, shall the orphanage buildings be insured or not? Mrs. Alving, of course they must be insured. Manders, well, wait a moment, Mrs. Alving. Let us look into the matter a little more closely. Mrs. Alving, I have everything insured, buildings and movables and stock and crops. Manders, of course you have, on your own estate. And so have I, of course. But here, you see, it is quite another matter. The orphanage is to be consecrated, as it were, to a higher purpose. Mrs. Alving, yes, but that's no reason. Manders, for my own part, I should certainly not see the smallest impropriety in guarding against all contingencies. Mrs. Alving, no, I should think not. Manders, but what is the general feeling in the neighborhood? You, of course, know better than I. Mrs. Alving, well, the general feeling. Manders, is there any considerable number of people, really responsible people, who might be scandalized? Mrs. Alving, what do you mean by really responsible?